When GMT Games released Commands and Colors Napoleonics back in 2010, and when it announced that the first official expansion for this series will be the Spanish army, many wargamers were disappointed. They expected to receive the Russians, the Prussian army, or maybe the Austrian army. And here they got the Spanish. Was this disappointment justified? Let's see. Hello, this is Michel Leviathan Sorbet, and you are watching a new episode of Wojennik TV. Today I'll show you one more game which will be focused on the Peninsular War fought during the Napoleonic Wars. This will be the review of the first official expansion for the Commands and Colors Napoleonic series, the Spanish Army. The Spanish Army, as well as the whole system, was designed by Richard Borg and released in 2011. When it was firstly announced after the release of the core game, many wargamers were scratching their heads. Well, they wanted to receive one of the major armies, for instance the Austrians or the Russians, which would enable them to play games in which we would be able to recreate the most important engagements fought during the Napoleonic Wars. So, for instance, Wagram, Borodino, Austerlitz. And here they got the Spanish army. Some of them were disappointed when hearing that this will be the first expansion, and some even said that this was only justified by the fact that if this expansion were to be released later, the people wouldn't get it. And so GMT decided to publish it, to release it before, in order to incite people to buy it. After buying this expansion, after playing it several times, I have my own thoughts about it, and I will share them with you at the end of this video. For now, I'd like to clarify that the expansion was the first official expansion, so at the moment when it was released, it was still designed for 2 players, so the game, as well as the core game, as well as using the expansion, was focused on 2-player games. This is a game which is quite easy to play in terms of the minimum age of the player, so 10 or 11 years old still applies even using this expansion. Inside the box you will find several components. Obviously new blocks, which will be yellow. This will be the Spanish army blocks. You will receive new Spanish units, but also some new French units, both units which were already present in the core game, for instance additional line infantry blocks, but also 2 completely new different units. Additionally, not less than 18 scenarios, so 3 more than in the core game. The Spaniards during the Peninsular War fought a lot of engagements against the French with mixed results. In most cases they were defeated in the field, but we cannot underestimate their strength and the impact that they had on the final result and the outcome of the war. The French had to maintain a big contingent of troops in the Iberia Peninsula, so those troops were unavailable elsewhere. So the commitment of Spanish troops, the fact that they fought so vigorously for the freedom, for the country, had a great impact on the final outcome of the war. Even though we speak not a lot of the influence of the Spaniards on the final defeat of Napoleon. We underestimate maybe this fact because they fought primarily on their soil. They fought for their major objective was to free their homeland. So in this video, I'd like to present you once more the components, which I have already showed you during a previous unboxing. Then I'd like to briefly explain how the new mechanic works, because in the game you will find also a new mechanic. And at the end of the video, as usually, I'd like to share with you my final thoughts concerning this expansion. And I will try to answer the question, is this an expansion which is worth acquiring, that you should have if you like the series, or you should skip it because it's not a thing which you could enjoy. So let's begin, and let's now dive into the box of Commands and Colors Napoleonics, the Spanish Army. Let's see what components are inside. Here is a quick look at the Spanish Army, the first expansion for Commands and Colors Napoleonics. Now, I have already showed you this expansion during an English unboxing, but I decided to show you all the elements which are inside the box once more in order to keep all the things concerning this expansion in one video. Now, the box, as you can see, is a lot thinner than the standard game because we receive significantly less components. This doesn't mean that we do not receive a lot of them in this expansion. So, firstly, we receive obviously a lot of new playing blocks. Because we receive the Spanish Army inside, we receive blocks in a new color, and this color is yellow. So the Spanish units will be presented on yellow blocks. As it was the case in the core game, we have both. We have artillery units. In the case of the Spanish Army, only foot artillery, no horse artillery here. We have cavalry. We have three kinds of cavalry. We have light cavalry, which are quite similar to the light French cavalry, although they come only in units of 3 blocks. We have the Spanish heavy cavalry, which also has 3 blocks and which is a heavy cavalry. And we have also the heavy cuirassiers, which are the most prolific, the most powerful Spanish cavalry unit. Then we receive infantry units, and we receive different kinds of infantry. We receive standard line Spanish infantry, we receive light infantry, which in the case of Spanish units is an infantry which is linked to units formed of 5 blocks. So we do receive huge light infantry in the case of the Spanish Army, huge infantry units in the case of the Spanish Army. We receive also some grenadier units, as you can see, very powerful units, and some militia, because obviously all of the battles will be fought in Spain. Apart from the yellow blocks, we receive also a certain quantity of blue blocks, and we receive both infantry units, for instance, additional grenadiers or additional line infantry. We receive also some cavalry units, and here 2 new types of units, because we receive a lot of new heavy cavalry units, but also new types of units, guard light cavalry, as you can see, and we receive also the light lancers, significantly the Polish very famous light lancer units. So you might ask, why the additional blue blocks? Well, firstly, because we do receive 2 new types of units. Secondly, because in some of the scenarios in this expansion, we will be needing a lot more blocks of some types than we received in the base game. So this addition allows us to play all the battles which are inside the booklet. Apart from the blocks, we receive all the elements which are part of each army. So we will be receiving a square board, which will be used by the Spanish player when he wants to bring his infantry units into square formation. We receive also Spanish banners, which will be used to track victory points, and also the markers, the square markers, which are linked to the square board. Apart from that, we receive 1 new type of marker. This will be the guerrilla action marker, because in the game we have 1 new mechanic which is linked to the Spanish army, which is used only by the Spanish army, and this is the guerrilla mechanic. Now, apart from those tokens, we receive also some additional terrain tiles. For instance, we receive new redoubts, which, as you can see, have more hex sites, more fortified hex sites. We receive some additional additional overterrain tiles. But when you compare those tiles and when you compare those markers to what we received in the base game, and also when you compare it to other games released by GMT Games, you come to the conclusion that they are extremely thick, and I don't like it at all. I think they are too thin, and even using them is quite bizarre because I have the feeling that they are so thin that it's even difficult to grab them sometimes from the playing area. So I would prefer them to be more thick. What we receive in this expansion are also additional player aids. We receive two kinds of them. Firstly, we receive two player aids which are structured in the same way as in the base game, with the difference that we have some indications concerning specific unit types. I have already showed the units, so you might have already seen that we do receive some additional indications. Now, in the first edition of the base game, there were no symbols on the blocks. We had only the depiction of the unit and the name of the type of the unit. Here, starting from the Spanish army, we also received additional small symbols on some of the units. Here, for instance, we have an indication that this is a heavy cavalry unit. We receive also a specific symbol on grenadier units, and also we receive a special symbol on light infantry units. So this indication, this small symbol, was added starting from the Spanish army, which in general is supposed to help you to distinguish some units from others. Now, returning to the player aids, those player aids are structured in the same way that they were in the base game. But to be sincere, I have almost never used them after acquiring this expansion. Why? Because apart from those two player aids, we receive also a different quick reference card, which is only double-sided, but which has absolutely all the information that we need in order to play Commands and Colors Napoleonics with the base game and with this expansion on this reference card, which is double-sided. On one side we have all the information concerning the French units, and on the second we have all the Allied units, the British, Spanish, Portuguese units, all inside very well designed tables. So we have the name of the unit, we have the coding, we have the number of blocks which are part of a unit, we have the movement ratio, we have the range, we have some additional information concerning if the unit can ignore one or several flags, additional notes which tell you, for instance, that in the case of the Spanish units, all of them will be retreating 2 hexes per flag, which is a significant problem concerning the Spanish army, but which is related to this specific kind of army. And then we have 3 sections. The first one is used when searching for the number of dice used when executing ranged fire by a unit, when executing fire after moving the unit, and finally the number of dice used in melee. So everything inside those tables, I love how they were put together, and I am only using them when playing the base game or this expansion. I believe this is the way that things should have been done from the beginning. The last element which we receive in this expansion is obviously the rule book, or rather the scenario book, because in this booklet we have firstly an explanation of what we find inside the expansion, so all the additional components. We have also the description of the new units. So as you can see, we receive Spanish infantry units, Spanish light infantry units, which have 5 blocks in a unit. We have the Spanish grenadier infantry, the most powerful Spanish unit, infantry unit. Then we have the militia, which works pretty the same way as all the militia units do. The three types of Spanish cavalry, which I have already showed you, and the specific French new units, the French light lancer cavalry and the French light guard cavalry. Now, the additional mechanic is the guerrilla mechanic, which is depicted, which is described on the 6th page of the booklet. How the guerrilla mechanic works. Well, during each scenario, in the description, we will be having an information if the guerrilla rule is in effect during this battle or no. If it is in effect, the Spanish player will receive a certain amount of guerrilla markers. The number of markers which a player receives at the game's start depends on the scenario chosen. It might vary from 2, 1 or even 0. But even if the player receives 0 markers, he still can acquire additional ones during the game. How a guerrilla marker works? Well, when your opponent plays an action card, you can use a guerrilla action token, discard it, in order to try to stop the enemy from playing the card. Now, when you do, the opponent has to roll a die and he has to roll sabers in order to execute his orders. If he's unable to, if he rolls anything else, the card is discarded without effect, the guerrilla marker also, and the turn of your opponent ends. So in fact, this is an extremely powerful tool which, used at the right time, can stop your enemy's offensive at once, or it can give you 2 moves in a row, which is also an extremely good thing. Guerrilla markers are used only once, so you use it and then you discard it. You can, although you can acquire new guerrilla action tokens during the game using scout cards. Scout cards normally work in that way that when you play a scout card, you execute only one order on one of the parts of the battlefield, and then you draw 2 cards. You keep one and you discard the other. When you are playing with the guerrilla mechanic and as the Spanish player, you can, when playing a scout card, draw only 1 card instead of 2, and you can also grab an additional guerrilla action marker. So this is the way how the Spanish player can acquire additional guerrilla markers. When it comes to the battles, we receive quite a lot of them. We receive all the major engagements of the Peninsular War, in which the French fought against the Spanish in pitted battles. So we have obviously the Battle of Bailén, which was the first major French defeat during the entire war. We have the Battle of Zornoza, we have the Battle of Gamonal, we have the battles of Espinosa de los Monteros, or the famous Battle of Somosierra, during which the Polish cavalry charged and managed to occupy, to take control of 3 consecutive Spanish artillery batteries. We have then the Battle of Medellin, the Battle of Alcañiz, Maria, Talavera, Tamames, Ocaña, which is an extremely interesting engagement because, as you can see, it is a battle in which we have only cavalry units, something which was not the case of the base game. Here we can play a no cavalry combat. Then we have the regular Battle of Ocaña, Alba de Tormes, we have the Battle of Barrosa, Albuera. We have also the Battle of Vitoria, so the biggest battle of the Peninsular War, or maybe the decisive one, fought in 1813, when the coalized army, composed both of Spanish, British and Portuguese troops, managed to score a decisive victory over the French led by Joseph Bonaparte, the engagement of San Marcial, and lastly Ordal Cross. So a lot of interesting battles. In terms of the number of banners which we have to score in order to win, most battles are engagements in which you will be trying to acquire 6, sometimes 7 victory banners. So those are not extremely big battles. If you are searching for an expansion in which you can play battles which are not extremely long to play, in which the number of banners is at a significantly lower level from other expansions, the Spanish army is an interesting choice. But I'd like to tell you more about this expansion in the last part of this video. So after having showed you all the elements which are part of this expansion, now let me invite you to this final part, during which I'd like to share with you my final thoughts and what I think about this expansion after playing several battles several times during the last years. When the whole series of Commands and Colors on Napoleonics was announced by GMT Games, this was an instant buy for me. I'm a huge fan of the Napoleonic Wars period, and I was searching for a game which would enable me to recreate battles on the tactical level fought during this war, during those wars. And Commands and Colors Napoleonics was the answer. I instantly bought or pre-ordered the base game, and I knew that I would acquire each and every expansion that were to be released. Commands and Colors Napoleonics, the Spanish Army, is the first official expansion, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, some wargamers, some players who decided to back the game when it was on P500 list, on the P500 list, were a little bit disappointed that the first official expansion was to be the Spanish Army. They complained that they would prefer to receive the Russians, the Austrians, the Prussians, but they got the Spaniards. Were they finally disappointed? Was I disappointed? I must say no, because this is an extremely interesting expansion, an expansion which gives you a lot of additional stuff which you won't find in other expansions released in the series. First of all, let's talk a little bit about what we receive in the box. I have already showed you what you receive, but now it's time to judge. It's time to finally say what I think about this content. So firstly, we receive obviously a lot of new blocks and a whole new army. This army is the Spanish Army. The blocks are yellow. I have seen some complaints about the painting of the yellow blocks, about the color used. I must say that after 11 years from acquiring this game, it still looks very fine. The stickers are still on them, or on the blocks. They do not come off. The color of the blocks is okay, and I must say that this is one of my favorite armies when I place them on the battlefield. I like the way how they look. The artwork on the stickers is also extremely good, and I like it really a lot. So in terms of quality of the blocks, of the stickers, I must say that the expansion is top notch. Secondly, we receive not less than 18 scenarios, 18 new, very different scenarios in which you will find such gems as for instance, the Okania engagement, the cavalry action, which is a scenario in which you will find only cavalry units. Something quite unique in terms of the whole series. Obviously, very different from what you received in the base game. Secondly, the scenarios which are part of this expansion are very different one from another. We have big engagements, smaller engagements, engagements in which you have a lot of cavalry, in which you have a lot of infantry, very interesting strategical situations also. Those are not extremely big battles, which can be found, for instance, in the Austrian expansion, where you have bigger battles than here. So this is an expansion which you can use when you are searching for scenarios which can be played a lot quicker than, for instance, when using the Austrian expansion. Here, most games will be decided when grabbing 6 or 7 banners, so not a lot of them, which means that the time of play will be significantly lower than when using some of the other expansions. I like also the new elements which were added to the game. Obviously, I like the new units, because we receive both new Spanish units, but also you receive two kinds of new French units. You receive the very powerful Lancers units, which enable you to reroll flags, and you can inflict hits with the rerolled dice. Additionally, each flag counts, so both the rerolled flags as well as those which will be rolled during the reroll will make your opponent retreat. And if you're playing against the Spaniards, the Spanish will have to retreat really a lot, because they retreat 2 hexes per flag. I like also the new addition in form of the new player aid. The new player aid is excellent. I do not like the original one, which was released in the base game. I do not like the one which is still present in this box, but the new form of the player aid with all the tables where you have each and every information about the units is extremely useful. And this is the one that I am using each time I play the Spaniards. Even when I play the core game, I only use this additional player aid in order to see how many blocks to use if I have any doubts. Then I also think that a good idea was the addition of the symbols on some of the stickers. So you have the additional symbols on grenadier units, on light infantry, on horse artillery, on heavy cavalry, and this is I didn't find it very useful, but I have seen a lot of positive feedback concerning this change by wargamers who say that this helped them not only to distinguish units on the battlefield, but also to search for specific blocks when preparing the scenarios. So, judging based on those opinions, I must say that this was also a good idea to include this change. Finally, what I really like in this game is the fact that not only the scenarios are very diverse, you get also interesting elements concerning the army, the Spanish army itself. The fact that each unit has to retreat 2 hexes per flag received makes this army very fragile, very delicate. And this is historically very accurate, because in most cases the Spaniards fighting the French in pitched battles during the Napoleonic Wars were severely defeated. And the fact that those Spanish units during the game have to retreat to hexes is quite historically accurate. This makes also the army very fragile and very difficult to play. You do have to have some depth when playing a scenario and a battle in order to have space in order to retreat. If you don't, you will be losing more blocks, having to fulfill the retreat, the mandatory retreat, than when taking hits in direct combat. This makes the Spanish army quite difficult to master, and when played between a Commands and Colors Napoleonics specialist or a grognard against a new player, I would recommend the experienced player to take control of the Spanish army, because it is very different from the French. It is more difficult to play. You have to be very careful during the battle, not to overextend, not to make foolish attacks, because you always have to keep in mind that retreat will sometimes mean disaster for the Spaniards. The French can sometimes launch attacks, keeping in mind that they can ignore flags when having some units. They can also retreat safely, for instance, to a forest or to a hill hex which is directly behind them. But here, when playing the Spanish units, you have to keep in mind that each flag will be a very dangerous situation. So those things, all those elements are things which I really like in the game. The last thing which I really like in this expansion is the new mechanic. The new mechanic which is related to the Spanish army, which is the guerrilla mechanic. Now this is an extremely interesting and also an extremely powerful tool, because without it the Spanish army would be considerably weaker than the French. With this tool they are only weaker, but not very, very weaker. So using the guerrilla tactic at the right time enables you to block a crucial card played by your opponent. Of course, he still has some chances of playing this card if he rolls sabers when testing if the guerrilla marker works, but the sole fact that you have this marker and your opponent knows that you can cancel his card adds an additional strategical layer to the game. Will you play as playing against the Spanish army? Will you play a strong card knowing that it can be cancelled, or will you try to play 2 strong cards consecutively in order to one of them being avoided and cancelled and the second one being resolved? It's also element of your strategy. So knowing that the opponent has such a tool will also influence your decisions. I like the fact that the decision to use the guerrilla marker is solely upon the responsibility of the Spanish player. He can decide when to use this tool, when to let your opponent play. I like this addition, although I must say that it is a mechanic which makes you think of the Peninsular War, because this war was full of partisan engagements, of guerrilla tactics. It was a very cruel war, a very bloody war, in which those small engagements, ambushes against French troops were very common. So the mechanic itself is well related to the whole Peninsular War, but is this a mechanic which was used during pitched battles? Absolutely not. So I have mixed opinions about this one, because firstly, I think it's quite climatic because it is related to the Peninsular War, but it's not a tool which would be used during pitched battles. So we have a certain contradiction here. The second thing, which I absolutely do not like in the expansion, is the fact that the quality of the other components, so of the additional terrain tiles, of the square markers, of the guerrilla markers, and of the banners, is significantly lower than in the base game. They are extremely thin. And I have seen several complaints concerning this element, and I have also seen that the GMT commented officially that this was a printing error, an error which was already known before the release of the game, but GMT decided to release it as it was. Of course, the components can be used. It's not that they are unusable. We can still use them, but the quality of them is such low that it makes me uncomfortable to use them. It's not the standard which GMT games usually has in its games. So the quality of this component is significantly lower than in many GMT games titles, and this makes us somewhat uncomfortable with the whole expansion. Although in terms of the quality, what you receive in terms of the diversity of the scenarios, the new units, the mechanics, it's a very good addition to the whole series. So answering the initial question, is this an expansion which is worth acquiring? Is this an expansion that you would like to play if you already own other expansions of the series? I'd answer yes, absolutely. This is a very interesting expansion, very different from the others. The Spanish army is also extremely interesting to play, difficult to play, engaging, but satisfying when you manage to score a win. So I'd say that if you like the series, you should grab this expansion if you have the opportunity. It's quite difficult to buy it right now because it is 11 years after its release and we still do not see any reprint. But if you manage to, and if you like the whole series, the Spanish army should be a very nice addition to the whole series. This was the review of Commands and Colors Napoleonics, the Spanish Army, the first official expansion for the whole series. Thank you a lot for watching this video. I invite you also to take a look at my other videos. Take also a look at what I publish on Facebook and Instagram. Have a nice day and see you next time.